Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
And it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marc Cortez, who is Academic Dean and Assistant Professor of Theology and Church History at Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon. He got his BA from Multnomah Bible College and an MA at Western Seminary before coming to St Andrews in Scotland to do his PhD. He has written on the topic of this talk, Embodied Souls and Soul Bodies, and on the bookstall we have his book, Theological Anthropology, a guide for the perplexed. And if you aren't perplexed about this topic, well, I certainly am. So do get that from the bookstall. Over to you, Marc.
Great, thank you very much. I was reflecting on the fact that we did start with the biologist and then the philosopher, and wait until everyone was snoozy after lunch before we brought the theologian on. I'm not sure if that's a relative weighting of the various disciplines or not. Really, from the beginning of the day today, we have been bumping up either implicitly or explicitly with the question of what does it mean to be human? What are we made out of? How do we act? How do we will? How do we decide? What makes us different from chimpanzees, if at all? What does it mean to be human? And to a large degree, that's what the question of this mind, body, soul, brain, soul, whatever language you want to use, that's part of what this question is after. What comprises us as human persons? And people have been wrestling with this from a variety of perspectives, probably since the beginning of time to some degree. And we have already heard a number of disciplines weigh in on the question of what makes a human person. What I want to try to offer is a theological perspective on the questions that we've been wrestling with and answering. Really look at, does theology have anything specific to offer as we try to wrestle with and answer this particular question? And even more specific than that, I want to look at something that Peter alluded to this morning when he referenced Jesus Christ as the revelation of God's intent for humanity. Is that the case? Christian theologians have long claimed that Christianity has a unique perspective on what it means to be human. Because Christianity has, in the person and work of Jesus Christ, the revelation of God's intent for what it means to be human. And one of the things that I found interesting is I've taken a look at this relationship between Christology, the person of Christ, and anthropology, the human person. So that Christian theologians are often quick to make the claim that Jesus Christ reveals humanity to us. But it's actually relatively difficult to find a Christian theologian who pursues that at any great length. In other words, so what? What difference does it really make to say that Jesus Christ reveals humanity? What does he reveal about humanity exactly? And as you look at the theologians who've worked in the area of anthropology, it's actually rather difficult to find someone who has gone the next step and attempted to spell out in a little bit more detail exactly what Jesus reveals beyond the moral realm. Lots of people will pursue the question of what's the significance of Jesus Christ for modeling what human living should look like. It's relatively difficult to find some who will take it in the other direction and say not just human living, but human being. What does Jesus reveal about what it means to be human? And that's the direction that I want to go with this afternoon, drawing to some degree, actually to a rather large degree in the first half, on the theology of Karl Barth. Largely because, as I was, again, looking around for theologians to interact with on this particular topic, Barth was one of the only theologians I could find who took this explicitly Christological starting point and fleshed his anthropology out through that lens. So Barth will be my dialogue partner through the first half, and then we'll see what we can apply as we move on into the second half. Now, before we get going, though, we do have to ask the question of why not just read the Bible? If we want to understand the Christian perspective on the body-soul relationship, why not just read the Bible, find out what the Bible has to say, and then you're good to go. It'd be a much shorter presentation. We'd get out of here and enjoy our afternoons a lot more quickly. But of course, the problem is that it's simply not that easy. And I don't want to recover the ground that Peter covered this morning, and I actually don't have a whole lot to add to this, what he mentioned about the specific terms. If you look at the Old Testament, you have terms like nephesh and ruach, and a whole variety of Hebrew terms for body. One of the interesting things about Hebrew, or the Old Testament perspective, is that Hebrew doesn't have a single term for body. The Hebrew language uses, I think, upwards of 30 different terms to refer to what we think of as our physicality or our body. Really, the Old Testament perspective as a whole isn't so much on the particular components of a human person, but really to refer to the whole human person from some particular angle. With a term like nefesh or ruach, specifically referring to the living being, the living human person, in connection or as an enlivened being by the Spirit of God. And so in Genesis 1, God breathes into us, as Peter mentioned, so that we become living beings. And in that sense, the Old Testament Spirit is really the principle by which things become alive throughout the Old Testament. One of the intriguing things about that part of Genesis 2 there, Genesis 2:7, when it refers to God breathing into us that we become living beings, we often skip over the fact, or we miss, that the living being, the nefesh chaim there in Genesis 2:7, was actually used throughout Genesis chapter 1 to refer to all of the living creatures. All living creatures are nefesh chaim, and because all living creatures have the nefesh, the enlivening Spirit of God, that which makes things into what God wants them to be. That's really the perspective of the Old Testament. The language really isn't there to tell us about the constituents, the components of the human person. The language is there to talk about the human person from a variety of different angles. We find much the same thing when we move into the New Testament, where we get soma and sarx, a language often used to refer to the body or the flesh. I hesitate here to say that they refer to the physicality of the human person, because even those terms are more flexible or fluid than we often recognize. Where soma, body, most often simply refers again to the human person as a whole, but with an emphasis to the fact that we are beings living and acting in a physical world. Okay? Not again necessarily just to refer to my body in distinction from my spirit, but to use a term like soma simply to refer to the fact that I am a physical being living in a physical world and acting and interacting with other physical things. So it's viewing me as a whole from a particular angle. Sarx, similarly, viewing me as a creature, often in distinction from a spirit-oriented creature. So if sarx just means flesh. In the New Testament, the term is often used just to refer to fleshly things, creaturely things, not even necessarily in a positive or negative sense, just that there are creaturely realities. It then sometimes gets used as a negative term in the New Testament, when the idea behind that is that my focus has become entirely on creaturely things, so that I become alienated from the divine or spiritual things, the realities that God has in store for me. So in that sense, if I'm a sarx kind of being, I've got a problem. Because biblically, I'm living an orientation away from God, and I'm not a spiritual being, I'm a sarx being at that moment. So both soma and sarx are terms that the Bible uses simply to view me from a particular angle. And then the same holds true for suke and pneuma, terms that we often translate as soul and spirit. Again, not normally in distinction from body, but to refer to me from a particular angle, where pneuma is used rather consistently, not exclusively, but rather consistently in the New Testament to talk about me and my orientation and relationship to God. So I am a spirit-filled person in the sense that I have a proper orientation toward God. Suke being a term that in the New Testament largely just means I'm alive. I'm not an inanimate object, I am an animate object, therefore I have suke. Obviously then not in distinction from my physical body, because I am alive insofar, right now at least, as I have a physical body. So we make a bit of a mistake in the New Testament when we read the soma sarx language in distinction from the suke pneuma language, as though they were understood to be at odds with one another, referring to different components of the human person. They're largely referring to me as a human person from a variety of angles. So one of the challenges, we say just read the Bible, is that to a large degree we're asking a question that the biblical passages were simply not written to answer. Most of the biblical passages that use this kind of language simply don't have in mind the question of, am I both body and soul? Am I one or the other? What am I? Most of the biblical passages are trying to address the question of what is my relationship as a whole being to God. That's the question they have in mind. So we have to recognize from the beginning that we're bringing a question to the text that's there. It's probably, it's not as though the biblical authors didn't care about what I am as a human person. It simply wasn't the question they were asking when they wrote the passages. So it's never quite as obvious as it seems. And we want to be careful about that because we think that the meaning of the text is much more obvious than they actually are, because of course we bring to the text, we bring to the biblical languages all sorts of cultural presuppositions. And I grew up in a rather conservative American evangelical context, really steeped in substance dualism, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So as I'm growing up, I read my Bibles, I run across spirit, soul language, or body, flesh language. The meaning of those passages is automatically obvious to me. I intuitively, right out of the gate, I know exactly what they mean. Because I was raised in a substance dualist context, and I was taught, I was really steeped in the idea that body always refers to physicality, soul always refers to the immaterial aspect of the human person. So when I bring those cultural lenses to the text, I run across this language, and it's immediately obvious to me what they mean. And so not only are the words themselves more nuanced in their meaning than we appreciate, but we often miss the nuance entirely because we just think the meaning is obvious. So a simple answer, of course, or solution would be to get back to, well, how would the biblical readers have heard those words? If I'm a first century Jew and I pick up a letter written by some guy named Paul and he uses words like suke and pneuma, how will I hear those words? I'm certainly not going to hear them like a conservative American evangelical. How will I hear them? The problem is that's not a terribly easy question to answer either. We have a tendency to think in rather almost binary terms when we look at the biblical cultures. As though there was a Greek way of seeing things and a Hebrew way of seeing things, and all I have to do is figure out with these early Christians, would they have heard those words like a Hebrew or a Greek person? Well, the simple reality is that it's much more complicated than that. There was no Greek view of the human person. Period. Have you ever hear anyone use the phrase Greek philosophy in the singular? Be immediately suspicious. There were all kinds of different views of the human person available to the first century hearers of the biblical text. You'll find substance dualism, monism, idealism, atomism, all kinds of different perspectives just in Greek philosophy alone. You move over to the Hebrew side of the equation and you'll find the first century Jewish scholars debating with one another as to whether or not there is a soul, an afterlife, or resurrection from the dead. So on both sides of the equation, you have tremendous diversity that would have contributed to how the biblical readers or hearers would have understood these particular terms. Which is why we can't just say, well, just read your Bible. Trying to look at this and provide a theological take on this particular question will take something a little bit more robust than that. Our question is made slightly more difficult when we recognize how many different views of human ontology there actually are. And now, I have not gone back to see if Graham McFarland is correct in his calculation. But if he is, 130 different views of human ontology is an awful lot to sift your way through. And it is something that I think we need to keep in mind as we approach this particular conversation. Because I often see people break down the ontology debate simply in terms of monism and dualism. And of course, there is a nice ontological line right between those two things. How many things make up the universe? One or two? It's a nice either or. You will oftentimes find people arguing for some form of pluralism, and that there are more than two things that comprise the world. I don't deal much with pluralism myself because I haven't seen an argument for pluralism that I think is much more than a nuanced monism. There's a lot of variety within the monistic or physicalistic realm. But if we break it down further than that, we see if we put these different views on, say, a spectrum or a continuum, we recognize that it's much more nuanced than simply monism versus dualism. Varieties of physicalism. Now, I like to make a distinction at one end between what I call eliminative physicalism and reductive physicalism. We've heard a lot about reductions. I'm not going to go into that too much. The distinction that I see here is that the eliminative physicalist is going to sit way on the, I would call it the extreme end of physicalism, arguing not only that everything is ontologically reducible to physical reality, that physicality is all that there is. You just have physical things and physical processes. So ontologically, everything is reducible to these physical realities. But epistemologically, everything is reducible to physical realities as well, at least ideally. So these are the people who argue that we should simply do away with all of our folk psychology, all of the language that we use. We should stop using terms like sociology, psychology, mind, whatnot. They're all myth. They're illusory. As a matter of fact, they're deceptive. Because they lead us to believe that there are things that exist beyond the physical. So we, to the best that we are able, we should simply eliminate all of them and just operate off of the terms of physics and the core sciences. Now they recognize that in reality we can't do that. It would simply take too long to say everything in the language of physics. But that's the ideal. That's what we should be striving toward. To the extent that we can, we just throw out all this garbage and speak in terms of the true reality that actually exists. Very few people are going to live down in the realm of eliminative physicalism. Most of those who are more toward that end of things will be reductive physicalists. Many of these will say, yes, everything is ontologically reducible to the physical reality. Epistemology is a little bit harder. It's not always necessary or even wise to try to reduce, say, physics or psychology to physics. It doesn't work, and it's not terribly helpful. So we recognize that ontologically everything reduces all the way down, but epistemologically we really need these other disciplines to help us function and understand and know the universe. More recently, a variety of people have come along arguing for a form of non-reductive physicalism. And we'll talk more about this one in toward the end here, because it's the one that I want to spend a little bit of time on. I guess at this point we'll just say it is still physicalism, but it's going to push back on reductive physicalism and say not everything reduces quite so easily. There are some things that we simply can't reduce all the way down that we need to recognize if we want to understand particularly human realities. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. Dual aspect monism. There is something inherent in this monist. I hesitate to call it physicalist because that kind of biases us toward a particular way of seeing it, but there's one substance that underlies everything in the created realm. But that one thing has a duality inherent within it that then can be expressed in different ways and at different times. And you might be able to unpack it more for us in the question and answer time if we want. And then emergent physicalism, which we heard about a little bit this morning. Everything that exists is physical, but as these physical things and the physical processes interact, higher level realities or properties emerge from it. Still in the realm of physicalism, that which emerges isn't some entirely new substance, but it is an emergent property, an emergent reality that has causal powers that needs to be taken into account in the universe. And the reason that I put them on a continuum is because as you move down toward the right of the continuum, the additional factors that need to be taken into account beyond the core atomistic physical processes, those additional factors become much more significant. I don't want to call them much more real, because again, that's leaning a little more towards substance dualism. I think you get the idea. Down toward the left of the spectrum, there are no additional factors. Everything is simply physical elements and physical processes. As you move down, you get to things that are much more significant and have to be taken into account. We also have varieties of dualism. And this is one that I often find necessary to emphasize because I feel like most people don't recognize the nuances within substance dualism. So we get a lot of criticisms of dualism that are really criticisms of Cartesian dualism or Platonic dualism, which are not the same thing, and are among the more extreme forms of dualism. And people will critique those forms of dualism and then feel as though they can do away with all forms of substance dualism, without recognizing that there is at least as much diversity among kinds of substance dualism as there is diversity among kinds of physicalism. So if we're going to look at these different theories, we need to do so in a nuanced way that does justice to the details of the particular theory that we're looking at. So again, if we start out all the way down at the end, this spectrum is going to move kind of in the reverse direction from the other one, where those at the end are really going to emphasize the distinctness and separateness of the two substances, physical and immaterial, or whatever you want to call it. And then as you move toward the right, they will, the distance and difference will significantly decrease. And all of the theories as you move toward the right are really seeking to still maintain two substances, but bring them into much closer connection to one another. Platonic and Cartesian dualism are the two that you probably hear the most about, with Platonic dualism really emphasizing the reality, the ideal world. The physical world is simply the shadow reality. It's the not good. It's that which we seek to escape and transcend so that we can again return to and attain the ideal state. Cartesian dualism also strongly distinguishes between the physical and immaterial reality, though without the negative connotations of Platonic dualism. Cartesian dualism, you never get the sense that the physical is bad. It's simply physical. It simply has attributes that are markedly different from the attributes of the immaterial reality. So the physical things have extension and shape and size. Spiritual, non-physical things do not. So Platonic and Cartesian dualisms are very different beasts in that sense. They've been critiqued heavily since probably they were first invented. And so many people now recognize that Platonic and Cartesian dualism, as they were originally articulated, simply are not adequate. That Cartesian and Platonic dualists haven't come up with good answers to the objections that have been raised. So a variety of dualists more recently have tried to offer more nuanced understandings. Holistic dualism, again, I won't say a whole lot about because that will be our parallel to non-reductive physicalism. Those are going to be the two that we look at a little bit later. Emergent dualism would be very much like what we heard this morning with emergent physicalism, that you have physical things that interact, and then from that interaction you have the emergence of, if you're an emergent physicalist, it's the emergence of physical properties and processes that have causal significance in the world. If you're an emergent dualist, what emerges from the interaction of physical things is actually a new substance. So you have the emergence of a new substance that then has causal significance in the world. So emergent physicalism and emergent dualism are going to sound an awful lot alike, and the rhetoric and the language of the two is very similar, but the conceptual framework is very different. And then Thomistic dualism, which we heard a little bit about this morning. I do see Thomism as a form of dualism, mainly because most of the Thomists, almost all of the Thomists that I know and that I have read are avowed dualists. The difficulty with Thomism that I think you were alluding to this morning is that the Thomistic framework and dualism don't sit well together. Thomism is drawing off of an Aristotelian way of understanding the human person, and the Aristotelian approach is very much not a dualist framework. It's what they call hylomorphic. You don't need to know that. But it's not a dualist framework. So what Thomas does is he draws on that Aristotelianism, but as he did with so much of his theology, he reshapes it in a Christian theological tradition and tries to use Aristotelian philosophy to articulate his Christian theological convictions. Sometimes it works really well. Here I'm less convinced. And it sure sounds like he's trying to make Aristotle's system do something it was never designed to do. And so you end up with a Thomistic dualism that's hard to understand. Now, all of that's just to provide background now for anthropology and Christology. As we try to wade our way through all of this variety and all of this diversity without clear biblical language to give us guidance, theologically, how do we get our hands around this particular project? And that's where Karl Barth steps in. This is a quote from his Volume 3, Part 2 of the Church Dogmatics. It says, "The ontological determination of humanity is grounded in the fact that one man among all others is the man Jesus." So the ontological determination, that which determines what it means to be human, is grounded fundamentally in the fact that one man among all others is the man Jesus. We are condemned to abstractions so long as our attention is riveted on man in general, as if we could learn about real man from a study of man in general. In this case, we miss the one Archimedean point given us beyond humanity, and therefore the one possibility of discovering the ontological determination of man. Theological anthropology has no choice in this matter. It is not yet, or no longer, theological anthropology if it tries to pose and answer the question of the true being of man from any other angle. So from Barth's perspective, if we try to approach this question of what it means to be human from any other angle, and he recognizes there are all kinds of other angles, and we'll get, in a second here, I'll comment on whether or not those other angles still have value. We say if we start from any of those other angles, we're in trouble. Because what we're doing is we're trying to start from humanity as we see it around us, and then trying to discern what true humanity is all about. And Barth says we're just going to get lost in abstraction. What we need to start with is the doctrine of the person and work of Jesus Christ. That provides the sure starting point for the conversation. Then we absolutely move into dialogue and conversation with other disciplines and other perspectives. But for Barth, that's got to be our sure starting point. And it raises the question, of course, of why. Why exactly is Christology, for Barth, the only sure starting point for theological anthropology? Well, his first has to do with the doctrine of election. For Karl Barth, the doctrine of election is fundamental for understanding what it means to be human. It's almost as if you look at it this way, if you think of God back in eternity, which don't do that too long, because that'll give you a headache. But think of God back in eternity, thinking about what he wants to do with creation. And coming to the conclusion that his grand goal for creation is to create beings with whom he could engage in covenantal relationship forever. That's his goal from all eternity. And then decreeing or determining within himself that he will elect humanity to be that with which he engages in covenantal relationship forever. And then more specifically than that, determining that in Jesus Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ, he will be the one with whom God fundamentally engages in covenantal relationship forever. So Barth's going to spend a lot of time on a verse like Ephesians 1:4, for he chose us in him, in Jesus Christ, before the creation of the world. See, for Barth, the election of individual people to salvation, as complex as that issue is theologically, is secondary. For Barth, the primary is that God elected to be God for us, that God elected to be in relationship with us in Jesus Christ from all eternity. So it isn't as though God created and then did a bunch of stuff, thousands of years, was hanging out with humans, and then decided to become incarnate and redeem us in the election. The decision or the decree of election in Jesus Christ came first. Everything else flows out of that. So in that sense, then Jesus, from all eternity, becomes the paradigmatic example of true humanity. Not just at his incarnation, but all the way from eternity in the decree of election. So from the decree of election itself, Barth draws the conclusion that Christology has to be our starting point for understanding humanity. Because from all eternity, Jesus Christ, the person and work of Jesus Christ, has been the paradigm of what true humanity was supposed to look like all the way along. He'll also draw on the imago Dei, or the image of God. So Genesis 1:27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the image of God, and I think we're hearing some about that tomorrow, or Barth's specific nuances of the image of God. But I do want to point out that the importance of the connection between Genesis 1:27, God created all humans to be in the image of God, and the startling turn that you get in the New Testament, where the New Testament testimony isn't so much that we are in the image of God, but Jesus is the image of God. Get that throughout the New Testament. If you're kind of reading through the Bible on image of God, it's actually rather surprising. Nowhere in the Old Testament do you get the sense that anyone other than human beings, as a whole, are created in the image of God. So you get to the New Testament, you get this startling testimony in several places that no, it's Jesus who are in the image of God. Our best bet is to be conformed in the image of Jesus. So that's the framework of image of God. The very first thing that the Bible tells us about human persons is that we're created in the image of God. And when we get to the New Testament, we find out the only way that we can really understand what it means to be in the image of God is to look to the person and work of Jesus Christ. So from all eternity, we have the doctrine of election grounding anthropology and Christology. We get to the creation of human persons, and we have the image of God that grounds what it means to be human in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And then we get to the whole problem of sin. One of Barth's big critiques for the way other anthropologies try to understand the human person is that we look at the way that humanity is as we see it now. Well, from a theological perspective, that's really problematic. Because we're all a mess. And the best that I can do, if I look around me and try to understand humanity, is I can come to a rather robust understanding of fallen humanity. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a valuable exercise in its own right. But Barth will argue, what you're not doing in the process is coming to understand humanity as it was supposed to be, or as God intends it to be in the future. If we want to understand true humanity, we need some touch point that does not have this sin problem that corrupts our understanding of anthropology as we see it around us. And so once again, Barth appeals to the doctrine of the person and work of Jesus Christ. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. And we could do a whole other hour on what exactly that means as well. But the idea, and particularly as Barth draws on it, is that Jesus then serves as the paradigm of true humanity, not just in eternity, or in the incarnation as the true image of God, but throughout his life and on into the future, because he is the one who lived without falling into the self-contradiction and self-condemnation of sin. So he not only was the paradigm of true humanity, but he remains the paradigm of true humanity because he lived out his humanity the way that we were supposed to. So for all three of those reasons, Barth argues that Christology has to be our starting point if we're going to have a theological understanding of the human person. A couple of methodological implications as we look to bring anthropology and Christology together then from this perspective. First, we have to recognize that this isn't an easy solution. It isn't as though we can just say, all right, well, Jesus reveals fully what it means to be human, so all we have to do is look at Jesus and we're good to go. Because Barth's going to draw on the fact that even within the person of Christ, we have to recognize both difference and identity with us. He is fully human, so I can look to the person of Jesus Christ and draw significant inference for what it means to be human. But he's not just fully human. So if you take the Christian theological conviction that Jesus Christ is fully divine and fully human in the incarnation, then I can't just emphasize identity, I have to recognize difference as well. And so I'll need to sift through the Christological data that I get and try to come up with some way of recognizing where there is difference and where there is identity. And of course, there's difference in identity, not just in the fact that Jesus is fully divine, but also in the fact that he's sinless. So on at least 2 points, I have some reason for saying, all right, whatever my methodology is going to be, it will need to be more nuanced than just, okay, look, there's Jesus, therefore, and draw some conclusion about anthropology. Second methodological implication has to do with interdisciplinary dialogue. One of the concerns that I often hear raised about this idea of approaching anthropology from Christology is that it sounds awfully locked into its own theological framework. I'm going to build my anthropology this robustly around the person and work of Jesus Christ. What in the what does that do for if I want to sit down with somebody who maybe has a Buddhist perspective on anthropology? Can we have any kind of meaningful dialogue? When I'm telling that person right out of the gate, your starting point is fundamentally flawed, and you really have no understanding of true humanity, because you're not starting with the person work of Jesus Christ. Or a secular cognitive neuroscientist. What kind of dialogue or conversation can we have when, again, I'm saying your starting point is flawed if you want to understand true humanity? So Barth often gets critiqued as building what they'll call a theological ghetto. He's completely isolated himself from pretty much any other voice. And all he can do is sit around and read the Gospels all day, trying to find out what true humanity looks like. And it's an unfortunate way of looking at things, because there's actually nothing about this perspective that says you can't have meaningful and significant interdisciplinary dialogue. Barth's argument only establishes or grounds your anthropological starting point. We start from the personal work of Jesus Christ. He never says you stop there. As a matter of fact, he's rather clear that you can't stop there. It's not as though Jesus reveals everything about what it means to be a human person. One of my favorite examples of that was when I was doing youth ministry. I was leading a junior high Sunday school class. And we were talking about this very thing, about the idea that Jesus was fully human, and that's great because it means he can empathize with us and he reveals what it means to be human. And one of my junior high girls kind of stops and she looks up at me and she says, well, but he was never a teenage girl. So how does he reveal what it means to be a teenage girl and all of the physical changes and tensions and processes that go along with that? And I, of course, told her that was a great question, and we needed to move on. This Christology was never, we're not talking about reducing anthropology to Christology, as though we can simply do away with anthropology and simply talk about Christology. That's not the idea. They remain significantly and importantly different disciplines. The argument is that you need to begin anthropology with Christological presuppositions in mind, but that you then move on from there. So I do engage in significant and meaningful dialogue with my Buddhist friend or my secular cognitive neuroscientist friend. Now, I never surrender my starting point in that. As a matter of fact, I explicitly, clearly, and committedly express my starting point in that, as I would expect them to do. Because, of course, they also have their starting points. And we have the most meaningful dialogue possible when we're all clear about our starting points. And then engage in meaningful dialogue, attempting to learn from each other in the process. So Christological anthropology does not have to be locked in its theological ghetto. As a matter of fact, I think done well, having a strong and clear starting point creates more meaningful dialogue with people operating from different perspectives. Ontological implications. This is the ontological implications that Barth draws as he looks at the person and work of Jesus Christ revealed in the Bible. And again, I'm using Barth here because he's the only one I could find who did it this clearly and consistently. David Kelsey in his Eccentric Existence, which came out last year, probably comes close and is a bit more exegetical in his theology than Barth is at this point. But this is where Barth goes with it. So Barth looks at Jesus as revealed in the Bible and says that the first thing that you have to lead with is oneness. As you look at Jesus in the Bible, you don't see a lot of substance dualism. You see a human person engaging other human persons in embodied, meaningful interaction. And that the consistent New Testament testimony is that Jesus is a person. That's the focus of the biblical data. And says, therefore, that has to be our starting point. If we're looking at what Jesus reveals about what it means to be human. He then moves on from there, though, and says we can't stop even there. We look at what the Bible reveals to us about Jesus. We do see a duality. Barth will never use dualism. Barth never uses anything ending in ism, I don't think. But he will say that there is a duality, in that you do see Jesus revealed as a person with a vital subjective life, willing, deciding, acting. He is a moral agent. He's responsible. He does all of the things that we associate with a person who has a vital, I don't like the idea of an inner life, but I think you know what I mean. It's a vital inner life. Even while he remains an embodied physical being with all of the needs associated with that. So even though Barth leads with, hey, we need to recognize that the biblical testimony is on oneness. It says if you look closer, you do see that kind of duality that we recognize in human persons. So he'll argue for a duality in unity, a differentiated unity. He's looking for a language to get both two-ness and oneness into the same perspective as he looks at Jesus. His third conviction is that this duality is an ordered duality. And he argues he uses very strong and explicit language that body and soul, and Barth will use those words, but he qualifies them rather carefully to make it clear that he's not using them in a substance dualist frame. But if you take body to mean my embodied reality and soul to mean the fact that I'm a subjective living being, it's kind of how Barth uses the words. He does argue rather strongly that the proper order for the human person is that the soul leads and the body follows. And the soul is the driving, determining factor in the human person, and the body is the, passive is a little bit too strong, but the controlled factor in the human person. And I would say this would be one of a couple of points in Barth's process where I think he can be most clearly critiqued. As we heard just a little bit ago, it's simply not true that as human persons, our soul or our subjective life always leads. I think we're all aware that our bodies are significantly influential in why the things that we do and why we do them. And we saw a couple of examples earlier where our body or our physical environment almost determines us to act in particular ways, where it sure looks like it's the body leading and the soul's kind of trailing along behind, making excuses for what the body's doing. So Barth probably oversteps, and he certainly overreads his Christological data at this point, because there's simply nothing in the Bible to suggest, as he's looking at the person of Christ, that Christ was not also subject to these physical influences that we see around us. My guess is Jesus was fully human. If somebody sticks a magnet behind his head and asks him to raise his hand, probably he's going to have the same magnetic influences that the rest of us would have had. So Barth does, I think, overread the data at this point. Although I think his basic premise, his basic point is an important one. Because his basic premise is that he wants to maintain that Jesus is a rational individual in the sense of he is, when he acts as a free moral agent, he is a free moral agent responsible for the things that he does. He's particularly concerned to defend here the significance of the atonement, in that whatever we understand freedom, free will, whatever to be, when Jesus acts to sacrifice himself on the cross, that is not something that was determined for him as though he is simply a passive recipient of prior signals, but that in acting on the cross, Jesus was a free agent, fully responsible for that particular decision. So there is a duality. It is an ordered duality. Barth also looks at Christ and says, whatever we do with the Christological picture, we have to recognize the significance of the Spirit for what it means to be human. The Holy Spirit is all over the place in the Gospels and significant for understanding Jesus' birth as the Spirit comes upon Mary. His life is empowered by the Spirit throughout. So the picture that we get from Jesus is that the Holy Spirit is vitally significant for what it means to be human, which of course fits with what we said earlier about the Spirit is that which makes things alive and makes them the way that God intends them to be, and the Spirit breathed into us at creation. So Barth will say that our anthropology has to be a pneumatological anthropology. It has to have a robust view for the Spirit. And then it has to be covenantal. And you look at Jesus and what he reveals to us about what it means to be human, it means to be in covenantal relationship to God. That must be one of our driving and deciding criteria. So, as I look at all of that, and try to, if this is true, if this is an adequate unpacking of what the ontological implications of Jesus Christ for understanding the person and work, the person and work of Jesus Christ for understanding human anthropology. And of course, you can always disagree with this, but if we're going to disagree with it at any point, we have to do it on the basis of what the data that we have about who Jesus was. and engage it in some different perspective. If this is accurate, then I argue that you can develop a Christological framework out of that that can be used for assessing the 130 ontologies on the table for understanding the human person. Now, I'm not going to go through all 130 of them, but what I am going to do quickly is try to unpack what I think the framework is, and then show you how it applies to non-reductive physicalism and holistic dualism, just as examples moving forward. So, Christological, let me back up here 1 second. I use the language of Christological framework because as I look through this, I don't think it commits us to any particular ontology of the human person. I don't think this way of doing things commits us to being a holistic dualist or a non-reductive physicalist, or certainly not an eliminative materialist. So I think it operates best as a way, a Christological frame for viewing these different ontological options and giving us a way of thinking them. So Christological framework. We're going to need some concept of selfhood, rather robust concept of selfhood. We need a sufficient understanding of self that can ground things like free will, moral agency, covenantal relationship, all of those kinds of ideas. We're going to need some understanding of consciousness. We talked about qualia and subjective consciousness with the subjective life that Barth describes in the person of Christ. If he is the kind of person who feels and thinks and experiences, we need an ontology that can ground that kind of consciousness. Continuous personal identity. We look at Jesus Christ as one who was born, lived, died, and then subsequent to his death was physically raised, and yet through all of that remained one human person. Then we need an ontology that's robust enough to answer the question, how does someone maintain continuous identity through those kinds of events, particularly death and resurrection? He obviously needs to be an agent. I mentioned that earlier. Mental causation, if we're going to have any kind of an ordered relationship between soul and body, or mind and body, then we need to have some framework for explaining how. How can mental realities have causal significance for physical realities? Freedom and responsibility. I have a really hard time separating those two. The real payoff for me in the free will discussion has to do with responsibility. And clearly Jesus acts in a way, or presents himself in a way where he's acting freely and therefore can be responsible for the things that he's doing. Embodiment, strong emphasis throughout that he is a physical being. And contingent personhood. And I draw this largely off the idea that the anthropology is a pneumatological anthropology. You only remain a human person insofar as the spirit continues to sustain you as a human person, because he's the spirit life, the one who makes us alive, makes us human. So we are not, as say a Platonic dualist might suggest, we are not eternal, immortal souls who exist forever in and of their own power, as though I simply am, and I will go on and live forever because my substance is indestructible in that sense. And Barth's Christological framework simply won't allow for that, because I only exist insofar as the Spirit sustains me in existence. So an ontological framework is going to have to be consistent with that kind of contingent existence. So we have 8 things in our Christological framework. As we apply them then, as I use this framework to try to think through ontology, I'm going to ask 3 questions. First, does any particular theory make the necessary affirmations? There's the 8 things we just listed out. If I look at a particular ontology, and it simply denies, just straight out, one of those 8 things, relatively easy to conclude that's probably not going to be something I'm going to look at and say is Christologically adequate. So, for example, Platonic dualism, pretty much right out of the gate I'm going to say no on the issue of embodiment. Because in Platonic dualism, my body really has nothing to do with who I am. I am my eternal soul. My body's just this physical cage thingy that I've gotten stuck into for a while and I'm desperately trying to escape. So on the principle of embodiment, Platonic dualism not only doesn't affirm it, but it explicitly denies it. So on the first question, I will take Platonic dualism, I'm going to move it outside the realm of the Christological framework and say it's not Christologically adequate. Doesn't mean that it's not fixable. That one might be kind of tough. But it does say, all right, on that point, to be Christologically viable, that one's got some work to do. So first is, does a particular theory make the necessary affirmations? Second is, can it do so coherently? Just because a particular philosopher can say, yeah, I believe in free will. Okay, that's nice. Let's look a little bit further now. And is that affirmation of free will coherent within your philosophical system, given the other things that you say? So if I run into, say, an eliminative materialist who says that he or she believes in free will, that's nice that you say that, but I'm going to have some hard questions as to how you can say that, given the rest of your philosophical system. And then finally, is there relevant data from other sources? Just because something is internally coherent, I'm still going to press a little bit further and say, all right, is there something else that I need to keep in mind? So if I have an ontology that says, yeah, we're free will because we're all made out of bubbles, I'm probably going to look at some other relevant data that I have available to me and say, yeah, still not a viable ontology of a human person. A couple of quick case studies. If we then use that approach to non-reductive physicalism, and first, as I mentioned, the inadequacy of purely reductive physicalism, I would say specifically on the issues of mental causation, free will, subjectivity, and consciousness. And I'm using reductive probably in a narrower sense than Tim was, and specifically those systems that either explicitly reject mental causation and free will, or really seem to entail it or imply it. So, and most people who affirm non-reductive physicalism would agree that reductive physicalism is inadequate on these points. Therefore, they move on and offer their own solutions by offering an ontology that is, I should have started with materialist. It is still a monist or physicalist system. It's not dualist in any sense. But they do affirm epistemological non-reduction. And so if we go back to that hierarchy that we saw earlier, they'll say that ontologically all of that is physical stuff. And nothing transcends the physical. But epistemologically you can't move down the chart. At each level there is sufficient coherence and reality at that level that it needs to be understood epistemologically on its own terms. You can't reduce it to the next level down without losing something important in the process. The next one would be the causal efficacy of mental properties. Once you've moved far enough up the chart to get to mental realities, those mental realities have causal significance. And that's where you get the concept of downward causation that we were talking about. Those mental properties can have causal impact on lower level realities. And what the asymmetric dependence of the mental. Even though these mental properties have downward causal significance, they are still ontologically dependent on the lower level realities. So it isn't as though the atoms of my body depend on my mind for their existence. And they're there, that my mind depends on the atoms for its existence. So the dependency is asymmetrical, even though my mind can have mental influence on my body and causing me to move my arm up and down. So that would be non-reductive physicalism. If I look through the kind of put my grid of the Christological framework around non-reductive physicalism, there are a couple of points at which it's going to do rather well. Strongly emphasizes embodiment, and it kind of has to, being a physicalist system, and does quite well with the idea of contingent personhood. Non-reductive physicalist, I'm clearly, if I'm a physical thing, I'm clearly not immortal, eternal, self-existent. We do have some weaknesses, though, and this would take a little bit longer to unpack here. As I look at non-reductive physicalism, I think it has a difficult job with really all of these. Subjective consciousness. As a matter of fact, one of the arguments for people who affirm something more like dual aspect monism is because the non-reductive physicalist has the challenging task of explaining how it is that physical things can have subjective experiences. Going back to David Chalmers' hard problem. We all say the chair here can't have qualia, qualitative subjective experiences. If I'm just a physical thing, albeit a rather more complex one, how is it that I can have subjective qualitative experiences? There just doesn't seem to be anything inherent in an atom that justifies the conclusion that physical things can have qualitative experiences. This has actually been one of the age-old arguments for substance dualism, is that there are these properties of the world that seem inconsistent with physical realities. The non-reductive physicalist struggles with this because it does retain enough of the reductive physicalist framework that it struggles to explain higher-level properties like qualitative consciousness. Continuous personal identity, insofar as non-reductive physicalism maintains that I am just a physical thing, it really struggles to explain how I can continue to be the same person through something like death and resurrection. It does just fine with my continuous personal identity until I'm dead, and they can appeal to the continuation of a living organism or a physical system. But once I'm dead and this physical system is destroyed, even if it is subsequently recreated in a way that is virtually identical to the first one, it's still difficult for the non-reductive physicalist to explain how it is that that is still the same as this in any non-arbitrary way. Seems like the best they can do at times is, well, God just says so. And looks down and says, I will choose to treat B just like A, and that needs to be good enough for us. And that just doesn't seem a strong enough answer to the question of personal identity. Mental causation, for the non-reductive physicalist, I still think is one of their most difficult problems. In the purely physical system that the non-reductive physicalist has available to him or her, mental causation is simply really difficult to explain. And how can it be, going back to the difficulty of downward causation that we talked about earlier, that if all you have are these physical things and physical processes, you can have what looks like downward causation. So it can look like my mind is causing my arm to move up and down. But the reality for the non-reductive physicalist still sure looks an awful lot like my mind only causes my arm to move up and down because other lower level realities determined my mind to have the downward causal effect on my arm that it has. Because everything, all the causal power still seems to be at the lowest levels of reality. And I have to admit that I'm somewhat suspicious that the language of mental causation in non-reductive physicalism is largely rhetorical. It's rhetoric that allows them to appeal to mental causation because they know that that's just a fundamentally important part of our understanding of what it means to be human. But the explanatory framework, how they can appeal to mental causation, seems, in my mind, still to be somewhat lacking. And therefore, along with that responsibility, non-reductive physicalism also has some key exegetical challenges. I mentioned the biblical terminology, but there are some biblical passages that the non-reductive physicalist finds harder to deal with, particularly any passage having to do with the possibility of an intermediate state between death and resurrection. If it's possible for me to continue to exist after the physical death of my body, the non-reductive physicalist has some explaining to do. So non-reductive exegetes spend a lot of time in 2 Corinthians and Luke and other passages that seem to suggest the idea that I somehow continue to exist after my death and before my physical or eventual resurrection. All right, so those would be the weaknesses of the challenges of non-reductive physicalism. If I move quickly into holistic dualism, mentioned the inadequacy of Cartesian dualism. I could have put Platonic dualism in there as well. I think both of them are pretty inadequate, and that's agreed to by most people. So holistic dualists will come along, and they'll say, all right, we're going to fix Cartesian dualism, and we'll do it by changing our definition of the soul, and we'll make it clear that the soul is, at least in some sense, derivative, or George is a little bit too strong for holistic dualist, but strongly connected to the physical reality, so that at birth, my body and my soul are interdependent. You can't have soul without body at birth. That's the way God designed us to be. They'll say the soul is spatial. One of the difficulties of Cartesian dualism is they have this completely non-spatial soul that has no extension, no location, and it runs into all kinds of problems. So the Cartesian dualists will say, no, my soul has a spatial locus. My soul is right here with me. It's coextensive, as it were, with my physical body. The soul is not just reason, it's also emotion, affection, volition. So for most holistic dualists, the person ideally is composite. I am not my soul in the sense that a Platonic or a Cartesian dualist might say. I am me, this embodied composite being that stands before you, ideally speaking. Now they're still dualists, so they will still affirm the idea that body and soul can be torn apart at death. But that's not an ideal state. It's a result or consequence of sin. And so although I continue to exist in this intermediate state, it's a truncated existence, existing not the way God wanted me to exist. Physical resurrection is a restoration of body and soul back to the ideal. Strength of holistic dualism. Like most dualists, they either don't struggle or don't think they struggle with the issue of consciousness, because they can take the mystery of consciousness and relocate it into the mystery of the immaterial soul and say, well, of course, we have qualitative experiences that are hard to explain in physicalist terms because there's an entirely another substance out there that has the properties that we associate with qualitative experience. Continuous personal identity, also not a problem, because at physical death, the soul continues. So the soul becomes the connecting line, establishing identity throughout any and all change. Freedom dualists, again, don't think they have too much of a problem there because the soul generally stands outside the deterministic framework of the physical body. So even if the physical reality is a deterministic reality, which can be an open question for the dualist because they'll often locate free will and responsibility in the mental causal powers of the immaterial soul. Weaknesses, mental causation. Pretty much any dualist still struggles to explain how this immaterial thing can cause physical stuff to do anything. How is it that not my mind, because I want to point at my brain, my soul, if it is immaterial and of a completely different substance than the physical reality, how does it cause anything to happen? It's the Cartesian problem. Holistic dualists try to get around it by bringing the soul and the body in closer connection to one another, but all that does is bring the two closer together. They never actually explain how it is that the causal joint between the soul and the body. And to the best of my knowledge, no dualist around has still offered an explanation of what this causal joint might look like. Most dualists will, again, here simply appeal to mystery. We're talking about an insubstantial immaterial soul. We can't study the soul, scientifically speaking. So the answer lies outside the realm of science. It's a mystery. Move on. Weaknesses, embodiment. And holistic dualists have done a great job of bringing my identity, gotta stop doing that, my identity more closely in connection with my physical body. But because they still affirm that intermediate state, it still seems as though my identity is fundamentally grounded in my soul, not my body. Because I continue to be me, even after my physical body has died. So it does raise questions as to whether the emphasis on the body that you find in holistic dualism is, again, more rhetoric than reality. Contingent personhood, I only put this in here because many people think that substance dualists all believe that the soul is immortal. And so they'll see that as a weakness with holistic dualism. The simple reality is that that's not true. Most dualists today do not believe that the soul is inherently immortal. We live forever if God chooses to sustain us in existence forever, not because we are comprised of some eternal immortal soul. Dualists have difficulties with science that they will respond to by more appeals to mystery. which is one of my biggest frustrations with pretty much any form of dualism out there, is it's difficult to get beyond this constant appeal to mystery. We can't explain that because these things all lie outside the realm of reason and science. So my conclusion, if I look at these two theories through the lens of Christology, I'm going to say they're both Christologically adequate, kind of. Any Christian that I know of affirming either of these two perspectives does affirm all 8 of the pieces in the Christological framework. I don't know any Christian non-reductive physicalist or Christian holistic dualist who would deny any one of the 8. So in that sense, they're operating within what I would see as a robustly Christological framework. Both have significant flaws. I'm not sure that either answers all 8 of those criteria particularly well. So I say both have a whole lot of work to do. That's my grand conclusion.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That's brilliant. Great classification and so on there. Dennis has a question.
Yeah, on this, so on non-reductive physicalism and the question of the intermediate state. Okay, so I guess, the two sort of traditional ways of addressing that, I suppose, I'm sure there are more. One is the kind of, what I call a fast-forward mechanism. So you die, and you zip out of time, and you fast-forward, and so time ceases to have any meaning, let's say, or coherence, and therefore you immediately, as it were, out of time, reunited with your resurrection body. So that would be one way of addressing it. The other way, which I think John Polkinghorne is quite keen, is that, it's a little bit, I think Peter had the analogy of you can write the poem in different formats, and you can put it on different computers and run it in different places and so on. So actually, if you like, the real person is taken up into the mind of God, if you like, if there is an intermediate state, if such a thing exists, and then is, as it were, downloaded into, to use computing language, but we have to use some language, is then downloaded into the resurrection body at the appropriate time. So, given these two sort of, fairly traditional kind of approaches, do you have any reflections on those?
Yeah, a couple. On the first one, the idea of an immediate resurrection. You go straight to resurrection, don't pass go. The two pushbacks on that are, one's exegetical, in that it's a little bit challenging to read the relevant passages. Not impossible, lots of people do it. But some people find that way of reading the passages weak. And if you're going to accept that those passages refer to death and resurrection, it sure sounds like there's death, temporal gap, resurrection. Now, a different option would be to argue that those passages don't refer to death, resurrection at all, that something else is going on, and that's what Joel Green will do, say, in 2 Corinthians. He'll say simply that passage doesn't refer to death and resurrection at all, and just take it off the table. The other issue is that the immediate resurrection doesn't resolve the physicalist problems with identity. It makes the problem happen a lot faster, but it's still, unless they offer some other solution, which is the second one we'll get to in a second, you still have a physical embodied being at point A and a physical being at point B, and a rather arbitrary connection between the two of them because the physicalities aren't the same. It's not as though God takes my physical body and transports it into the future, but that this physical body dies, and then temporally, immediately, God recreates another one. So you have the physical discontinuity between the two. That's difficult to explain, which is why many physicalists, not all of them, Peter van Inwagen will actually argue rather creatively that there is no temporal gap between the two bodies, that God creates a copy, a simulacrum, at the physical death of this body, which he preserves, and then that serves as the point of continuity on into the future. And he has to do that because his argument is that personal identity, continuous personal identity, is grounded in the continuous living organism. So that I'm the same I that I was when I was born, because there's been one continuous organism the whole time. So if I'm going to continue to be the same I that I am on into the future, there has to be some connective continuity.
Can I
So
rest? That's great,
I haven't got to the
yeah.
second one.
Yeah,
We haven't got to the second
so that's
one.
first one.
Yeah.
Second one
Yeah.
really comes down to whether you find psychological grounds for continuous identity convincing. And one of the biggest philosophical objections that people will raise there is that it makes identity somewhat arbitrary. Because if it's possible for God to upload my memory and then download it on into the future, why couldn't he do it now? Why couldn't he do it 10 times in the future? Make one copy of me and then download it all over the place. So rather than my identity being something that is somewhat constant, it becomes something that has a purely external ground. There's only one of me, only because God has chosen not to duplicate me over and over again. Many theologians and philosophers simply don't find that appealing.
One come back there. I mean, doesn't it come back then to one's trust in the faithfulness of God and one's doctrine of the character of God in that context? That God is not some randomizing, Deus ex machina who might actually just copy, individuals to the fun of it, but actually is faithful to that particular loved individual who has a biography whom he created. So wouldn't you fall back, I think, on the faithfulness of God in that context?
Well, to an extent, there is a conceptual difficulty in that. Insofar as you are a physical being, God could presumably create an exact physical duplicate of you right now, atoms and whatnot. If your mentality and narrative history is also duplicable, that means it's technically possible for God to create an exact replicate of you, such that it would be impossible for anyone, even God himself, to determine which of you was you. The identity in toto is duplicable. That just creates some problems for identity. If you could have two exact things that are indiscernible in every way in that. But yes, what most people in that sense will do is just say, well, God wouldn't do that. And that's why I say it seems to fall back on the arbitrariness of it.
Yeah, there are a number of questions. If I could just have one. There is a very significant difference between us and Christ, insofar as that his body was not there. The tomb was empty. It looks like his resurrection body is in some sense the transform. It had the wounds and so on. Our bodies could be burned. There's a discontinuity there, which doesn't seem to be with Christ.
Unless you look to the ascension, which seems to be more the completion of his resurrection so the resurrection ascension really should be held together as one complex event, with the ascension being the completion of the resurrection purposes. That's how I would read it anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. We have lots of questions. Yes, at the back, Barry.
Yeah, I'm not sure all physicists would agree with this, but going back to the same problem that Dennis is raising, if you have body A and body B, that they're not the same body, there is a very strong principle in quantum physics that all particles are identical and that particles cannot have ownership. So that if you have body A and body B with different particles, you cannot identify them as being different. So the particles do not belong to body A or body B. It is how they're put together. And that's a very strong principle in quantum physics.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't find arguments for continuous identity built on bodies to be terribly convincing at all. I think I think physicalists would be well served to look elsewhere in either a mental framework, which I find that one problematic as well. Many will just go with narrative. That every human person has a story that goes along with that human person that grounds identity. And they'll use that as what they think is a solution to the objection that I raised over here, in that even if God created two identical Dennises, two identical ones, they still have different stories. They have different narratives. Now, I may not be able to tell the difference, because I don't know them well enough to know which one has the story of just got created and which one has the story of has been around for a little while. But at the very least, I can say that there's one being who knows the narrative. So it still grounds identity in the mind and person character of God, but in what looks like a less arbitrary manner, in that God's not just arbitrarily saying, well, that one's Dennis and that one's Dennis B. But the identity is grounded in the fact that he knows the story of them and their relationship to him. Others have found that narrative framework to be a little bit less convincing.
Thank you. Yes, Rene.
So I have a question about anthropology being based in Christology in the way that you've explained as Karl Barth goes about it. Now, if you take it really seriously, then shouldn't you come up with a sort of straightforward form of dualism? Because Christ was already existent before the incarnation. At least that's the classical teaching of the church. So Christ's existence, or the existence of the second person of the Trinity, was in no way dependent upon its incarnation. And therefore, surely there was, for some important trajectory of time, there was a close connection between Christ and a body. But that, in a sense, was perhaps the condescension of God in a Calvinian way, as what we spoke about yesterday. So wouldn't this lead actually quite straightforwardly to some form of dualism?
Right, and some have made that argument, that Christology in that sense does almost necessitate dualism. This is an area where actually I appeal to the importance of recognizing the difference between Christ and us, in that we're not an incarnation of deity in humanity, we're just human. So I don't find it legitimate to move from, because Christ was divine prior to the incarnation and becomes incarnate, that therefore I should draw a conclusion from that about human persons, because we're not similarly pre-existent, divine, and then joined to a body.
Then doesn't that make the basing of anthropology in Christology, doesn't it make some sort of ad hoc? So this is what we like and this is what we don't like, or this is wrong?
It certainly opens the door to that I think we need to be careful with. I'm not as concerned about it with this one, because there seems to be such a clear differentiator between Christ's humanity and ours in this one, in that we're explicitly appealing to his deity in the question of the incarnation. It would be different, say, if we looked at the fact that Jesus lived largely in community. And many people look at the person work of Christ and say, hey, if you look at how he lived, it sure seems as though we're relational. Which is one of the things I didn't put in my framework, but other people probably would. Say relationality is fundamental to what it means to be human. If at that point I said, well, yeah, but he's different than we are because he's divine, that would seem rather arbitrary. There's nothing about that reality that he lived in community with other human persons that's appealing to his deity or his sinlessness or anything that would differentiate him from that. So that would be my one thing that would hopefully protect it from being ad hoc, is before I can say, well, that's an example of difference, I have to have something to justify that there's a difference at work there.
More questions? Yeah, there's one there.
Just a question about, is there any discontinuity between Christ's humanity pre-resurrection, post-resurrection?
Yeah, I'm markedly reticent to say much about the details of Christ's humanity post-resurrection, mostly just based on the data. We simply don't have much. The one clearest piece that we have is actually out of 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is describing the post-resurrection body. But even that is light on details. Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Well, as far as I understand, your point of departure from your framework is Christology. Here, there are some theologians redefine the concept of Christology, or divide Christology from above and Christology from below, like Wolfhard Pannenberg. And I find your approach is quite Barthian, that we start from Christology as a point of faith and then we move on. So if we say that we should start from Christology from below, from the historical Jesus of Nazareth, and start to read it that way, to redefine, for example, revelation, for example, between Pannenberg and Barth. Barth emphasizes the revelation as self-disclosure
Mhm.
and defines the idea of faith based on it, while other theologians like Pannenberg emphasize on revelation as history, and always talk about God of history, not simply God.
Mhm.
So, does it change the whole frame, the structure of the framework, if we talk about Jesus of Nazareth, or start from Christology from below,
Mhm.
because this is related, in some sense, to the point
Mhm.
mentioned now, that we don't have one pack that is, for example, the Earth is 3 layers, Earth of Paul, for example, and Jesus and the resurrection. No, we have something historically. There's a piece of history in Jesus,
Mhm.
and there is a piece of the metaphorical approach, like the sort of creation. We have different genres. So if we start from Christology from below, does it make any difference in our approach to anthropology?
My short answer is going to be probably. It's difficult to be definitive, again, because so few theologians that I have found have moved from Christology to anthropology in the area of ontology and developed a way of thinking along those lines. I have to assume that, yes, if you have, well, let me start with yes, if you have a different Christology than I do or I have articulated here, that's absolutely going to affect your framework. So, for example, if you were going to jettison the idea that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, maybe he's just fully human and is the exemplar of a human life well lived or something along those lines, that's going to radically impact the framework that goes on here. It would still potentially, maybe, agree with my argument that we should move from Christology to anthropology, although I'd have a harder time justifying that move, because all 3 of my arguments for why we should ground Christology in anthropology presuppose a high Christology. I don't think it necessarily presupposes that you have to do a Christology from above, but your Christology, once it's developed, whatever methodology you use to develop it, will probably need to be a relatively high Christology, or yeah, you will end up with a significantly different framework from there. The one approach that I've run into that I haven't had a chance to tease out in this context would be somebody who would argue that what we have in the Incarnation isn't humanity as God fully, it isn't fully realized humanity. That it's still broken humanity, lived in a broken world for us. And that the closest that we get to fully realized humanity that actually could serve as an exemplar of true humanity, as I'm trying to unpack it here, would be the eschatological humanity that we don't have access to. But that's where I think the sinlessness piece of mine comes into play. And I do would want to make clear that what I think this gets us is a starting point for understanding true humanity as it's constituted prior to the eschaton. If you have an anthropology that says in the eschaton we're going to be radically different than we are now, that's fine. That's not where I'm trying to go with this. I don't think we have access to that.
Okay, we've got a minute or two yet. Any more questions? Gosh, I'm stunned into silence.
Well, this approach of starting with Christ, I mean, your approach was to use that and then make a sort of grill,
Mm-hmm.
and then compare it with what the different philosophical positions propose. And but in any case, you did, as you say, adjust your grill according to other information as well. So suppose you've done it differently. Suppose you've done it the way other people who don't start with Barth and don't start with Christ have done it.
Mm-hmm.
Would this have actually led to different conclusions?
Mm-hmm. I've wondered that. I actually dealt with that in my dissertation to some extent, asking the question of, did I end up exactly where I would have ended up if I had just jettisoned Christology from the beginning? And I was a little bit concerned that what I ended up with was relatively close to a fairly intuitive understanding of humanity in that mental causation and free will and selfhood and consciousness and whatnot. These are all pieces that you run into in all of these discussions. And from one angle, the best that I can come up with is possibly, but on a much more secure ground. In that, unless I'm wrong, I don't think I just imposed my understanding of what the human person needs to be, and then found that in Christology, although that's something I need to be sensitive to, that I just take my understanding of the human person, just overlay it on the Christological data. So hopefully I didn't do that. But even if I ended up from Christology with the same concepts that maybe a popular anthropology might have, I've done it on what I would consider to be a more sure foundation. So that if somebody challenges me on, does the human person really need to be viewed as a responsible moral agent? Well, if I just say yes because I think so, okay, that's nice. As opposed to yes because I think the person and work of Jesus Christ establishes that it be so. It's just a very different answer. It's the same answer, but it's answered on very different grounds. So I do think it makes a difference.
I think that's a helpful point on which to end, and we'll give you a big round of applause.